All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our first day of UC GIS Week. Our very first session this morning will be on the California environment. We have three 15-minute presentations today, and we're going to take all questions at the end of the three presentations. Please leave your questions in the chat, and I'll be able to read them out to our presenters after they present. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Donghong Ji of UC San Diego for mapping coastal cliff erosion along the California coast using statewide LiDAR datasets. I'm excited to welcome Thomas Crummell from California Fire to talk about producing vegetation burn severity data for the state of California. Thomas, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Maggie. So let me go and share my screen here. Yeah. So thanks for having me today. As you can see, I'm not affiliated with the UC, but I'm a graduate of UCSB's geography program. And today I'm going to be talking about our efforts at the Fire and Resource Assessment Program's, work to produce vegetation burn severity for the state of California. All right, so let me get into it. There we are. So the first question that we have, is, what is burn severity data? There's two concepts that often get confused. The first is, fire intensity. Fire intensity is, during the fire, how hot, vegetation burns and the type of convective heat that it, gives off and emits. This is not what burn severity is. Burn severity primarily focuses, after the fire has occurred and looking at the effects of, the fire on the vegetation and the type of environmental change it's caused. When looking out at a landscape, you can kind of see what it looks like. There's an area up there on the high slope areas that looks, high severity. Looks like there's almost complete mortality of all the trees. Or down there near what seems to be a creek, there's low severity. You can tell that not all the forest is dead. And then areas in between where this fire came through where there might be mixed effects. To get a closer look at it, which I mean, a lot of these photos are from prescribed burns, you can see that unchanged is you're not really going to see any changes in the understory or the canopy. Whereas low severity, you might see loss in the understory, but most of the large established trees are going to survive. Moderate severity is going to be a mix of effects, whereas high severity you're going to see stand replacing fire or complete mortality in the forest. Um, so yeah, so now knowing, what burn severity is, there's a question of why is CAL FIRE producing burn severity data? As people who work with this data might know, USGS and the U.S. Forest Service already produce and put this data out through the Ravage and MTBS programs. But there's some, several issues with that, for the state. Primarily, the data that those programs produce is for, federal land ownership and, focused on the U.S. Forest Service lands and, BLM lands. In addition to that, most of those lands are forested, so they have conifer hardwood forests on them. And a lot of California is, either in state or private ownership, and it's also non-forested. So those are some gaps, that we'd like to fill, here at the Fire and Resource Assessment Program. A good example of this is the, SCU complex fire, which, happened in the hills, kind of east of San Jose. In the bottom left map, you can see those colored areas are composite burn index for, forested areas. So there's methodologies for those, but all those areas that aren't shown in color on that map are areas that we don't really have methods to produce data for. And in addition to this, this is, one of the maps that was produced. This is not something that would have been produced by USGS or US Forest Service, simply because it's, not on federal property. In addition to that, there's a number of CBI plots that are out there. As you can see, well, maybe you can't see in this map, there's not a lot of plots and a lot of them are concentrated on, federal forested lands in the country. And in fact, in the, state of California, a majority of the burn severity plots or, field validation points are in conifer forests and shrublands, where for some of these other, forest or vegetation types that burn and we'd like to understand severity at, there's really not a lot of validation data to, do our work. This is also complicated when you get into different systems, in forest vegetation, if a tree dies, a tree dies. It's something that's been there for a long time. Whereas in, shrub environments, you might see really quick resprouting at the base of shrubs. And in grassland systems, you might even see, enhanced growth, the growth here afterwards. But in both of these systems, it's not really well understood, what burn severity means, because of the regeneration of the vegetation in those areas. But yeah, so addressing all these questions, the actual reason, CAL FIRE is producing this data is back in September of 2024. The California State Senate passed a bill, 1101, to basically, produce burn severity maps for the entirety of the state of California. The reason that they wanted to do this was to basically expand the scope and scale of prescribed fire, and understand, after wildfire has gone through, what areas, have been maintained, what areas can we go back to and reintroduce fire into the forest, and then what other areas have been, completely nuked and we need to go in and do, more restoration work. So our work on FRAP is kind of broken down into three phases. Phase one, we've already completed. We're in phase two, and we're moving on to phase three after phase two is complete. So phase one, we completed in July. Basically, we ran this for 2015 to 2023 fires and produced burn severity data for those fires. We put it on a viewer in ArcGIS Online, which is in the gallery for UC GIS Week. And with this, we used existing methodologies that were easily accessible that I will, describe in more detail later in this talk. Step two, which we're working on now, we're going all the way back to 1985 and producing burn severity data for, all fires that we, possibly can. We're researching, how to produce composite, burn index data for chaparral and grasslands and other non-forested systems, and are doing a, general review of, where do we need more plot data to validate our methods, and how is this data most useful to the research community and what they want. So a big part of this is, coming to events like this, opening up a conversation with potential users of burn severity data, and understanding how, students and researchers at the University of California, might find value in this data and how the FRAP program can, better produce data to meet those needs. So potential users we're interested in talking about, are people that are managing these landscapes, researchers. There's a lot out there, and we're interested in talking to you and working with you on what needs you might have for this data. Of course, in producing it, we have a lot of contributors on the FRAP team, people that are guiding the work and doing the technical efforts. We have a technical advisory committee, a lot of people that are already involved in producing burn severity data just for different programs or direct users of it, and especially representatives of our stakeholder groups which find real value in this. Okay, so now the meat and potatoes of this talk. How is burn severity data produced? So there's several ways to do it. The first is, of course, in situ data collection. This was defined in a paper by Keeb Menson back in 2006. Basically, there's this form, where you go to a 30 by 30 plot and you look at the different levels of the forest after a fire has happened, and basically average out, the severity of the fire and what happened there. Although this is extremely useful and the most accurate form of composite burn index that's collected, it's time consuming and really it's hard to get an expansive view of a landscape doing this method. So a lot of times these points, the composite burn index and what was defined there, is used as a way to validate later spectral indices and better understand what we can produce. So that brings us to the next one, which is spectral indices. Before and after a fire, if you look at, Landsat or Sentinel imagery, you'll see that there's been a change in the imagery. Here I'm showing a, false color composite, and you can see that there's been a serious change in terms of like the reflections of near infrared, to the point where like it no longer is green and it turns red. This happens because, once vegetation burns up, the spectral reflectance changes, particularly in two bands that are used in a lot of these indices. First is the near infrared band. As you can see on this, there is a higher reflectance with living vegetation and a lower reflectance with dead vegetation. Whereas on the other side of the scale, in the short wave infrared or mid-infrared band, that relationship has been completely switched. So when you look at a specific area and you calculate normalized burn ratio for a single date, you can get an idea of comparing the near infrared and the mid infrared bands to understand just how severely an area might have burned. And this is useful, but it's not relative to, what that area looked like before. Desert areas, there might be a lower initial state for vegetation health. So that, just using NBR might miss out on like, the relative, of that specific environment. So a common one used is DNBR, which is the change in normalized burn ratio, which looks at two different dates and compares the NBR values to kind of get a relative view of what that looks like. There's several other indices, relative difference, normal ratio, relative burn ratio, and yeah, and they essentially do the same thing. It's just that, the papers that have written them and created them, it's just correcting it just a little bit so it fits that field validation point slightly better. And this is what it looks like. So you can see there that RDNBR image is just much easier to use. And if we look at graphs of, those field plot data, those CBI, we can see, there's a pretty good relationship that those actual indice values have with CBI, and it can be roughly mapped out to like, understand what the composite, the burn index is, so low, moderate, high burn severity. And these are helpful, for interpreting indices, but they're not super easy to use, and there's a lot of numbers that are essentially meaningless unless you're thinking about the color values. So to pull this out, there's been a lot of effort to kind of bring that indice data into something that's a little more useful. So a lot of this comes in the form of logarithmic regression models. This is what the federal government mainly uses in the MTBS and Ravage program. They're developed by Jay Miller and several associates. So this one basically takes the RD and BR values, maps it out with CPI, and maps a logarithmic or a curve on the data and tries to basically take that to say, okay, if we have this RD and BR value, we can map it to that curve to roughly understand what the composite burn index is. The advantages of this, of course, are you're converting a more complicated number and bringing it into something that's a little more readable for land managers. A value from 0 to 3 with easy divisions as to what the burn index is. So there you go. As you can see, it's a lot easier to interpret, a lot easier to understand, and easier to categorize and use in the field. There's been some improvements. So the model that we used is a multivariate model, basically in this paper by Sean Parks and several associates in 2019, giving ecological meaning to satellite-derived fire severity metrics. The team took several different variables associated with burn severity and climate and geography, and tried to see using a random forest model what was the most influential on predicting the actual composite burn index value of the field data that was there. In the work, they found that latitude, which is how north or south something is, and the aridity or climatic water deficit of that that place is the second and third strongest indicators of what the composite index burn value is. So in the script that that paper produced for Google Earth Engine to produce CBI data, it basically takes in climatic water deficit and latitude along with RBR, and produces a CBI that is from the review that we've done probably the best method out there in terms of predicting CBI, because it is relative. So jumping into it, like I said, and I'll post this in the chat, there's a Google Earth Engine script that was published along with a paper that allows this data to be produced. This mainly looks at, for example, Landsat data for multiple years. And the value of Google Earth Engine is it's all there on the cloud. You can just take it, you can process it. So it goes through 4, 5, 7, 8, and 9, produces a mean composite for the June 1st to September 15th period, for 1 year before the fire happening and 1 year after the fire happening, and produces that RBR product. It's consistent every year. It's on the leaf-on period, and it's able to produce, a consistent and usable product that catches delayed mortality, and other differences about the landscape itself. And once you run the model and pull everything out in Google Earth Engine, you end up with a bunch of geotiffs, which cleanly produce the data in a way that's easy for us to scale because we don't have to do single scene selection, and allows us to produce all the fires we have. So here's the Dixie Fire, affected Plumas County, one of the second largest. And another example, the August Complex fire, which is the single largest fire in the state's history, and kind of composite burn index looks over the ground. So finally, we'll get to how it's accessed. In choices that we made, we've only looked at fires over 1,000 acres. We've only published, things from 2015 to 2023, but 2024 and January 2025 is coming. It's a 1 year post-fire severity, so we're not looking at stuff immediate. It's going to catch delay mortality. We have 2 different indexes.
Maggie, it looks like we may have lost Thomas.
Yeah, I see that. It did sound like he was wrapping up. If hopefully he'll be to Clancy McConnell of UC Davis in the meantime. I want to remind folks too, please put your questions, comments, feedback in the chat that we'll be able to take after all 3 presentations. But otherwise, Clancy's going to talk about reforesting California using GIS. So I think a really great pairing with what we were just talking about. Clancy, take it away.
Thanks, Maggie. And Jason is going to join me today. He's going to demo our website for us. So anyway, yeah, hi, I'm Clancy McConnell. I'm a postdoc at UC Davis in environmental science and policy. Our project is in the Thorn Lab. Jim is also on this call, so we've got everyone involved here to help answer questions, including our awesome undergraduate researchers. So this is going to be kind of a focused talk on one project. I did kind of label it broadly, but we're trying to help address reforestation across the whole state. And this is a follow-up to a presentation that I gave last year on the same project, but last year I presented the methods. This year will be on kind of the deployment of the tool that we've made. So I'll start by giving a brief introduction to the project just to give you some context, and then I'll hand it over to Jason to do the demo of our tool that we built. Oops. So California's forests are struggling. You just saw some of that from the previous talk. Fires are more severe for a number of reasons. We've had fire suppression, droughts, pests, and then on top of all of that, climate change. Things are getting hotter. We're experiencing these extremes, extreme droughts, extreme wet years. All of this is kind of synergistically coming together to cause a lot of environmental stress. And to address that need, one area of effort has come out of CAL FIRE's Reforestation Services Program. This is actually right here in Davis. It's over on Childs Road, the CAL FIRE nursery. And this graphic that they gave us pretty much has sort of an adaptive management take on the reforestation cycle. They just reforest private non-industrial timberlands. So that's non-timber land that's not doesn't grow trees for harvest, not public land like US Forest Service or BLM. And they reforest that using participation from private landowners. So in this whole cycle, they go out and collect seeds, they store them in the seed bank, they have to test all the seed lots, there's a lot of processing. Then they get orders from landowners for reforestation after a fire or another disaster. And they grow those seeds right there at the nursery, they provide them to the landowners. And part of that process involves reaching out to landowners to solicit participation in the program because it's all on private land. So we come in right here on number 2 in the cone collection portion of the reforestation cycle with them. So this project goes back a few years. So, with climate change, as I was mentioning a minute ago, species distributions are changing. Trees can't move. So, climate change is happening so fast, we might have to help these species when we reforest the landscape. It's not so simple anymore as just collect the seed from where the tree, grow and plant the seed collected locally. We might actually have to do some assisted migration because of climate change. We're seeing this within the graphic on the upper right, ponderosa pine. And doing a climate exposure assessment on a really good range map, we're able to assess where are the highest priority areas in the state for climate exposure. And we can focus on those areas as one variable in our tool. So we kind of asked the question, how can we help adapt? And within that mindset, what's our annual adaptive management cycle taking into account environmental factors and operational needs, like where we need to actually reforest, where we're getting the most orders, where has there been a severe fire, that sort of thing. And so we can address this using a bunch of different variables in one prioritization framework. So we can say, let's get those areas that are most exposed to climate change, the areas that are at highest risk of a severe fire, a stand replacing fire where there's been so much fuel load. We calculate that with a relative fuel load. There's so much fuel load that it would just burn everything, including all of the viable seed. So we want to go target those areas for seed collection before we lose that seed forever. And then also the areas of high operational priority where there's a lot of demand for the seed, but not that much seed or no seed stored in the seed bank over here at the nursery in Davis. So we combine all of that together, and that combination process we're calling a triage assessment. Like you would take in a patient in some kind of disastrous situation, a lot of different patients, and you have to triage them for care and take care of the ones that need it the most first. It's the same concept here where we're saying these are the highest priority areas to go target for seed collection. So we have a workflow. That was my presentation last year, where we create a really good species range map, which you can come to our talk later today and learn all about that. We assess the environmental exposure, in this case, just climate change and high severity fire risk, and then operational priority. We combine all of that together in a GIS workflow and triage these seed zone elevation bands. They're just a unit on the landscape used for forest management. All of those methods were also detailed in this publication from January of this year. So that's also a new development since the presentation last year. So if you want a detail on the methods, you can reference this paper. So now I'm going to hand it over to Jason, who is going to give you a demo of our cone scouting tool that puts all of this together in a framework for managers and the public.
Thanks, Clancy. Hi, everybody. I'm a geography graduate student at UC Davis right now. And like Clancy mentioned, I put together this website to help visualize the data. And as more maps become available, we will add those to the list. So hopefully you can see my screen. And feel free to go to this website. It's conescout.duckdns.org. It's if you're interested in the technology, it's running on AWS in Docker containers. So I put this all together, and you can even watch the talk from last year. I have a little link to that if you're interested in that. So we have this little about page, and then kind of the meat of it right now is in this range map area. So what we have here, it's basically a GIS tool to easily go through. And right now I have all the species we have available, about 40 something species, 42 species. And you can see it's covering just the state of California. So then if you're interested in a certain area or a certain species, you can load that up. And then if there's overlapping species, you can click on the location. It shows you all the species at the location. You can get directions to the location. There's a link to the CAST tool, which is another reforestation tool, looking at genetics. But if you just go to Zoom screens covering the controls there, close that. So if you just go to this, basically the way you use it is you can select a species. It's organized by genus. So let's just go to pine. So if I select all the pine, now all the pine species should show up. And it's this is just the range, right? So these are the range maps that Clancy and Jim and Ryan and others have developed using the process that Clancy explained and in the paper. And yeah, these are linked to ArcGIS Online data sources, which are available, and we'll cover that more in the workshop later today. And then the risk map right now, these are where the different attributes are applied. So currently there's just 2 in here, and as those become available, those will be added to the list. But you can select the different attributes that help to visualize the risk. So there's climate exposure risk, for example. You can see for ponderosa pine, these are the calculated risk values for climate exposure. There's fire intensity risk and combined risk. And then there's also the operational factors that go in, like the current supply at the seed banks, landowner demand, projected demand, and then the combined priority. So that's just kind of a quick demo of the tool. Feel free to go to it yourself and explore the data. As I said, the risk map attributes will be added as those become more available. So with that, I'll hand it back to Clancy.
And Jason, actually, maybe you could just share screen real quick one more time. Just one more
Sure.
little thing I wanted to point out there.
Yeah.
So when we presented this tool much earlier this year at a short stakeholder workshop, we actually had foresters there, people that do the work for the Forest Service, or even that work for private industry like Sierra Pacific Industries or Green Diamond. And a forester come up to me and say, hey, listen, I've got this grant money for this fire. So is there a way that I could just get your results for the area in the fire perimeter? And so we added that capability in this region of interest on the bottom left there. So you can upload a file for maybe a fire perimeter or a national forest or a county or whatever it is. And then you can download the tabular results, which give you all of our ratings for all of these different factors for all of the seed zone elevation bands in that region of interest. So anyway, that's one way that we kind of help operationalize it for people doing the work on the ground. And this also has the API link where you can click on it. It'll take you to the CAS tool. So anyway, we'll also have more time during the workshop this afternoon if folks want to ask questions about the range map workflow or this. We can talk about both because it's all in one website. All right. So I'm just gonna take a couple minutes to just kind of tell you what's next. Now that we have this web tool, obviously it's not finished yet. There are 100 tree species in California. We're going to finish out the range maps. We're finishing about 25 of the risk maps. So it'll go from 2 to 25 really quick here. And it's being used by CAL FIRE already. So what's next really? Well, every year we get fires. So that'll be an annual update. And we incorporate that in a couple different ways. I mean, I finished 2024's fire risk analysis, and then, we had the Eaton and the LA fires down in LA in January. So then I had to redo the fire risk right away. So that's kind of a constant thing that we have to do. Additionally, we get new seed inventory and demand from the Reforestation Nursery here in Davis every year. So that's one thing that we're keeping up with. We have interest from Green Diamond in helping them use our range map and our prioritization framework to help them replant Douglas fir in the northwestern part of the state. So that's kind of one lead we're using to figure out how we can help the private industry reforest in a climate adaptive, genetically sound way. And then lastly, I'll use a little case study here. We're also helping CAL FIRE. That's kind of the whole point of this on these private non-industrial timberlands. So this Reforestation Services Nursery over here on Davis, this is their website. You can go there and learn more about the program. There's some neat YouTube videos. They also actually give public tours. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, you can go out there and check it out in person. But we have this great synergy between what they call the assessment of need and our cone scouting tool. They give us their assessment of need and they tell us these are the highest priority seed zone elevation bands for the seed that we know we're going to need to reforest. We incorporate that into our framework, which has a whole bunch of other variables, and then we give them back our prioritized seed zone elevation bands, and that helps them with their resource assessment. And I'll give you an example of that. So here on the website, Jason showed you a few of the attributes just now. And if you go to the total SEB rank attribute, which is the final ranking that tells you of all of the seed zone elevation bands for that species, it ranks them 1 through however many, in this case is ponderosa pine, 1 through about 700. And if you check that box to show the top 10% only, then you'll get this. You see a few little red spots. So this shows the range in just the top 10% ranked seed zone elevation bands. And CAL FIRE takes that and they use that to figure out which landowners they're going to contact to solicit participation in their reforestation program. They send out about 400 pamphlets to these landowners, and then some of those landowners say, yeah, please come collect seed on my property. CAL FIRE reserves a fraction of those seeds to reforest that landowner's property, so they keep really good track of it. So anyway, that's kind of how we're helping the nursery over here, and we're trying to expand. So if you have other ideas or questions, that's a wrap.
All right. Thank you so much, Clancy and Jason. Super excited for your workshop later today, and we love seeing our repeat UCGIS Week visitors. It's so great to see how these projects evolve over time. I'm going to pass things back to Thomas before we get to our questions. Thankfully, Thomas is able to make it back. So Thomas is going to wrap up his presentation on vegetation burn severity data.
Yeah, thank you. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. Luckily, I lost internet pretty much right at the end, so I don't have too much more. But I think this is where it's left off. So yeah, so getting back into it, we run everything in Google Earth Engine. There's a really quick script that runs it using the Parks et al. 2019 methods, kicks out the geotiffs that come into Drive, and we can process and put this data out as is. Here's the the Dixie fire, for example, which happened in Plumas County, the second largest fire in the state's history. August Complex fire, which happened on the other side of the valley, the largest fire in the state's history. Yeah. So the last part of this talk is how it's accessed. We've also created a tool to kind of share and put this info out. Some caveats on that is that it's only going to be fires that are over 1,000 acres. We've only published 2015 to 2023 now, although we will soon be adding 2024 and January 2025 fires, in addition to going back. It's a 1-year post-fire assessment of severity, so this stuff comes out. It captures delayed mortality. We're only focused on 2 different types. There's the composite burn index, which is that 0 to 3 value for forested areas only. So if it's not a conifer forest or hardwood, there's no CBI data. But we did produce relative difference normalized burn ratio for all vegetation types, just so that's visible to see what that is. This is what the viewer looks like. I'll drop the link in the chat. But basically, it allows you to just kind of go through and search up the fires you're interested in, get some basic information on the perimeter, and then draw back the curtain and look at the the severity data for different fires across the state, whether or not wherever it is. So yeah, so I'll go ahead and post those links in there, and yeah, that's it. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much. I'm going to open the floor for questions now. Please put your questions in the chat. Thank you to all three of our presenters. I have some questions for folks, but I want to make sure I leave room for everybody else to have the opportunity to ask their questions as well. So I'll start with a question I have for Donghan from our first presentation. You mentioned how the clifftop retreat rates seem to be much higher in Northern California, especially around like Humboldt, the very far northern parts of the state. And you mentioned how you think some of this might have to do with beach width. Are there other reasons why you think some of these rates might be noticeably higher in Northern California when compared to more southern parts of the state?
Yes, so thanks for the questions. This is a great one because we always struggling what controls the clifftop retreat, and there's a lot of things going around, like the precipitation, the geological movement, and also the sediment types in the cliff area. So I mean, like the beach dimension can be one controlling factors, like because like we see like wave digging, on the bottom, when the bottom kind of like become like unstable, they kind of be failure, and the whole body start to become unstable. On the other hand, it's like the precipitation on the top can also become another factor because you have so much water coming down and it kind of like making the interior structure become also unstable. So there's a lot of factors going around. So that's why in the Northern California, it rains quite a lot, right? As you see, sometimes they have a significant we say cliff landslide. But on the other hand, now the next research we're going to focus on is like how much beach that we can just to organize in trying to reduce this recession. But again, a good question. Like why the Northern California is higher is basically like you have a lot of precipitation coming up. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I hope you will consider attending a future GIS week as you continue your work on this. And I have a question for Thomas. I know this is a newer project, a more recent project. I'm curious, what are some of the uses you've seen of this data by researchers so far?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I can say, at least internally, we've started using this data to kind of just monitor trends in burn severity in different parts of California and describing how that, changes vegetation. There's a product that we put out called the, FRAP vegetation product, which is the CWHR classes of all vegetation types in California. We'll certainly be using that data to, help educate, how we change that, the vegetation types in California every year. But I know for land managers, from what I've talked about, the potential uses, although I haven't talked to someone who's done this yet, is, in high severity areas, people can kind of plot out and map, just how much area is going to need to be reforested, especially where, there was stand replacing fire. And for prescribed burn professionals, knowing where that low severity and moderate severity area is kind of gives them an idea of, how much land they can go back and begin to, plan burning projects on after a fire has gone through.
Awesome. Thank you for that.
Thomas, is this does this kind of take the place of MTBS?
Not exactly. So it's this data is produced using slightly different methods than MTBS. It's the parks et al. Methods. So I think for researchers it really is kind of another option to have out there. At least for our work, we'll be using this primarily. We're hoping that it's especially useful for the areas that MTBS doesn't produce data for, so non-forested vegetation types, non-federal land ownership. So we're hoping to just kind of fill those gaps into creating another product that's available for research to have access to.
And this is something that'll be produced annually?
Yeah, so every September, we'll produce kind of like a new edition of the extended assessment. And it's like you said, very new in its development. So we're in discussions. Maybe we'll produce kind of an initial assessment of like immediately after the fire. We might produce some slightly different indices. I think we're going to be producing RBR data in addition to RD and BR, or in replacement of. So, yeah.
Okay, yeah, I asked just because we use MTBS for this tool that we just presented to calculate areas that burned at high severity over a certain, time period, and pretty much say, don't go collect seed there because there's no more seed left.
Yeah.
And we've been looking for an alternative to MTBS, so maybe this is it. So it'd be really great to use it. So glad it's there.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah.
Amy, it looks like you have a hand.
I do, and I'm curious, Thomas, like what are the collaborations with neighboring states? Sort of knowing, right, that vegetation doesn't stop at the boundary, and are there discussions with neighboring states, or where does that fit in?
Uh, Great question. So I can tell you for the data that we are producing, we're producing data that goes over state boundaries. So if there's a major fire that, is in California in another state, we're producing data for the entire fire, not just, what's in California. Um, I'm not sure. I don't think we've been talking to other states about, collaborating or if they're producing data that's completely within their state. So far, I think our plans are really only to produce this data for things that happen, within the boundaries of California.
Hey, Tom. This is Jim Thorne over at UC Davis. I've got a question related to that. So we run a hydroclimatic model called the Basin Characterization Model that is a mechanistic version that generates climatic water deficit. And we've recently updated that to a 90-meter version. And we calculate it for California plus the watersheds that flow into the state. And so there's a little bit of Mexico that qualifies, and then there's the Klamath River and the Smith River and the Tahoe Basin. And so I wonder what the reaction at FRAP might be if you were to look across that extent, because it does play into the hydrology of the state as a whole. Thanks.
Certainly. Yeah, I think in Jim, correct me if I'm wrong. I think we do that for the FVeg product, try to include at least, the whole Tahoe Basin and some other ones. But it's an interesting idea. I think the main limitation is the fire perimeter data. We'd have to begin collecting it in a wider area outside of California, but it would certainly make sense to do that. So that's valuable feedback. Thank you for that.
I think we have time for maybe one more question before we move on to our second session of the day. Well, if there are no further questions, as Clancy mentioned, the California Tree Range Atlas will have a workshop this afternoon at 4 o'clock. So you can find the link to that on our UCGIS Week website with our schedule. And I'd like to invite everybody to our 11 a.m. session, which will be at a different Zoom link. So please, again, find our schedule to hop into that, but we will have 3 presentations on public health challenges in GIS. So please feel free to come join us in that Zoom room in a few minutes. And thank you again to all of our excellent presenters. Super exciting. I know I learned a lot already, and it's only our very first session of GIS Week. So we hope to see you at more sessions throughout this week. Thank you, everybody.